I recall the metallic tang filling my mouth when they first announced my selection. The declaration came from Adept Thalison, delivered in that emotionless tone that all administrative scribes seemed to master after their initial decade of duty. Citizen Kalen Voss, designation 77 Alpha 9992. You have been chosen for the Emperor's holy duty. He never lifted his gaze from his data tablet as he spoke. His mechanical eye whirred softly while processing the data streaming across the display. The noise brought back memories of the grinding machinery in the processing plant where I had toiled for the past 15 years. I remained standing in the gray intake chamber, bare soles cold against the steel flooring, attempting to comprehend the meaning behind those words. Holy duty? I had overheard rumors, naturally. Every citizen of Terra understands there are individuals who vanish into the Imperial Palace depths, never returning. We convince ourselves they are blessed. We convince ourselves they fulfill a role beyond our understanding. We tell ourselves countless things to find sleep at night. The metallic taste intensified. I discovered I had bitten down on my tongue. There must be an error, I stated, though my voice seemed fragile in the resonating chamber. I am merely a plant worker. I service the grinding equipment for grain processing in Sector Gamma 7. I possess no exceptional abilities, no specialized training. No, there is no error. Adept Thalison finally raised his head. His organic eye appeared brown, weary, framed by the pallid skin of someone deprived of natural illumination for decades. The selection procedure is comprehensive. Your genetic patterns, your psychic resonance readings, your mental evaluation, everything has been reviewed and approved. You will present yourself to Sanctum Level Omega 33 at the 19th hour for preparation. The chamber seemed to contract suddenly. The walls coated in that institutional tan that exists nowhere in the natural world appeared to close in. The overhead illumination strips buzzed with a frequency that made my jaw ache. I became conscious of my respiration, how rapid it had become, how the recycled atmosphere carried hints of metal and sanitizer. What precisely is holy duty? I inquired. For the first time, something resembling feeling crossed the adept's features. It could have been sympathy. It could have been jealousy. You will maintain the beacon that leads humanity through the void, he explained. There exists no greater privilege. He returned to his data tablet, and I realized our exchange had concluded. The transit from the intake chamber to my residential unit required 47 minutes through the transport networks. 47 minutes during which I observed my reflection in the scratched, transparent panels and tried to reconcile the image staring back with the words I had just received. Chosen? Selected? Holy duty? The phrases felt alien, like a dialect I had once understood but forgotten. My reflection held nothing remarkable. 34 years of age, brown hair beginning to thin at the scalp, gray eyes containing no special insight or power. A narrow scar crossing my left cheek from a machinery accident 3 years earlier. Hands roughened by decades of physical labor. Fingernails permanently darkened with lubricant despite my efforts to cleanse them. An unremarkable man, living an unremarkable existence in service to the Imperium, or so I had believed. The residential unit remained as I had departed that morning, a single chamber, 8 meters by 6, containing a sleeping pad, a small table, a food preparation unit, and a sanitation alcove. The walls displayed the same institutional tan as the intake chamber. Upon the table sat a single framed photograph of my parents, both deceased, captured on their wedding day 47 years past. They smiled at the camera with the authentic joy of people who believed the future held promise. I settled on the edge of the sleeping pad and studied their faces. What would they think of their son's holy duty? Would they feel pride? Terror? I realized I did not know my own thoughts. The remaining hours passed strangely. I attempted to eat but discovered no hunger. The processed protein ration flavored to resemble some extinct meat turned to dust in my mouth. I tried to read from the small collection of approved texts in my table drawer, but the words blurred before my eyes without comprehension. The Imperial Primer, which I had studied hundreds of times, might as well have been written in an alien script. I attempted sleep, but found myself examining the ceiling panels, counting the minor flaws in the metal plating. 63 dents, 12 corrosion marks, one panel slightly misaligned with its neighbors. When the signal chimed for the 19th hour, I was prepared. The transport system that conveyed me to Sanctum Level Omega-33 was unlike anything I had encountered in my years on Terra. Most citizen transport tubes were functional designs meant to move large numbers of people efficiently through the Hive City's endless passages. This was different. The capsule was smaller, lined with what seemed to be genuine wood rather than the synthetic materials I knew. Bronze fixtures gleamed in the gentle amber light, and the air carried the scent of incense rather than recycled atmosphere. 7 other passengers shared the capsule with me. All of us chosen for holy duty. All of us trying to understand what that meant. We sat in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts, our own fears, our own attempts to grasp the significance of what was happening to us. The woman facing me was young, perhaps 25, with the pale complexion and slightly curved posture of someone who spent their days hunched over data tablets in the administratum's endless filing chambers. Her hands trembled as she gripped a small pendant shaped like the imperial ocula. When she noticed my observation, she offered a weak smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Mira Ka," she said quietly. "Data analyst, 3rd class, sector Beta 9. "Kalen Voss," I responded. "Maintenance technician, Gamma 7. The elderly man beside her looked up from his own contemplation. His hands bore the distinctive burn scars of someone who had worked with promethium for decades. "Marcus Thorne," he said, in a voice roughened by years of breathing industrial vapors. "Fuel processor, been in the deep works for 38 years. Figured I'd die down there among the pipes and burners. Never expected this." One by one, the others introduced themselves. Helena Vex, a young woman barely 18 who had been working in the textile manufacturum since childhood. Dmitri Vasquez, a middle-aged man whose augmentic arm marked him as a former tech servitor operator. Jiren Cole, a teenager whose nervous energy suggested he had been pulled from one of the lower hive's youth brigades. Senna Thale, an older woman whose lined face spoke of years in the agridomes, coaxing life from Terra's poisoned soil. Ordinary people, workers, the backbone of the Imperium's vast industrial machine. None of us heroes, none of us particularly special, just citizens who had somehow drawn the attention of the selection algorithms that govern such things. "Do any of you know what holy duty actually entails?" asked Dmitri, his augmentic fingers tapping nervously against his thigh. No one answered immediately. Finally, Marcus spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell stories. He said back when he was young, before the purges of Gehenna, he claimed to know someone who had worked in the deep levels of the palace. Said there were places down there where they fed souls to machines, where they turned people into batteries for things too terrible to name." "That's just superstition," Mira said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Emperor protects. Whatever we're called to do, it serves a purpose." "All service serves a purpose," Helena replied quietly. "That doesn't mean we survive it." The transport capsule began to descend more rapidly. Through the small windows, I could see the architecture changing as we went deeper. The utilitarian corridors of the upper hive gave way to more elaborate construction. Stone replaced metal. Gothic arches soared overhead, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed directly. The air grew thicker, heavy with incense and the ozone smell of high-energy machinery. We were entering the true heart of the Imperial Palace, the domain of the Adeptus Mechanicus, where technology and faith merged into something that transcended both. Servo skulls drifted past the windows, their eye sockets glowing red in the dim light. Occasionally we passed chambers filled with massive machines whose purpose I could not begin to guess. Pipes thick as hab-block corridors carried fluids that glowed with their own light. Cables the size of transport tubes pulsed with electrical current, and everywhere, carved into every surface, painted on every wall, etched into every piece of machinery, was the symbol of the imperial ocula, the two-headed eagle that represented humanity's dominion over the galaxy. Its wings spread wide, its heads turned to watch both the past and the future. But down here in the depths, the symbol seemed different somehow, more predatory, as if the eagle was not protecting humanity so much as preparing to devour it. The descent continued for what felt like hours, past foundries that glowed with the heat of artificial suns, past libraries where servo-scribes recorded information on scrolls of human skin, past chambers filled with vat-grown creatures that I tried not to look at too closely. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The weight of 10 millennia of accumulated faith and technology pressed down on us like a physical thing. I looked around the chamber again, taking in the full scope of what awaited us. Dozens of thrones, all occupied. Dozens of people who had once been like us, now reduced to empty shells connected to a machine that fed on their essence. And in the center, that terrible black throne that pulsed with its own malevolent life. The central throne is different, I observed. Indeed, it serves as a focusing mechanism, channeling the combined psychic energy of all connected souls and directing it toward its intended purpose. It also houses the intelligence that coordinates the entire process. What intelligence? For the first time, something almost resembling uncertainty flickered in the tech adept's mechanical voice. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness assigned to oversee this facility. A portion of his divine intellect severed from the whole and tasked with the management of holy duty. It has been changed by its proximity to the process. 10,000 years of witnessing the death of the faithful has affected it in ways we do not fully understand. The implications sent a chill through me. A piece of the Emperor's mind, isolated down here in the depths, watching thousands die every day for 10 millennia? What would such an experience do to any consciousness, even a divine one? What would it become after witnessing so much death, so much suffering, all in service of a greater purpose? You will be processed in order of selection, the tech adept continued, gesturing toward the waiting thrones. The procedure is brief but intensive. Your individual consciousness will be preserved for a short time as your body adapts to the neural interfaces. After that, you will become part of the greater whole. Mira was first. They led her to one of the smaller thrones with the same mechanical precision they showed in all things. She walked slowly, as if in a dream, her hands clutching the Aquila pendant so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When they helped her sit, she looked back at us with eyes wide with terror. "Tell them," she whispered, "tell them I served willingly. Tell them I died with honor." But there would be no one to tell. We were all destined for the same fate. The needles slid into her arms with surgical precision. Tubes connected to her neck, her spine, her skull. The crystalline growths from the central throne began to extend toward her, reaching out like hungry fingers. When they made contact, her entire body convulsed as if struck by lightning. Her scream echoed through the chamber, a sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Her face went slack, her eyes rolling back to show only the whites. The readings on the tech adept's instruments spiked, then settled into a steady rhythm. "Connection established," one of them announced. "Soul integration at 97% efficiency. Psychic resonance within acceptable parameters." Mira, data analyst 3rd class from Sector Beta 9, ceased to exist as an individual entity. What remained was a conduit, a living battery, feeding power into the great machine that kept humanity alive. Marcus went next. The old fuel processor faced his fate with stoic dignity, settling into his assigned throne without resistance. "Worked with fire all my life," he muttered, as the needles found their marks. "Fitting that I should become fire in the end." His transformation was quieter than Mira's, but no less final.
One moment he was a man with decades of experience and accumulated wisdom. The next, he was part of the machine. Helena followed, then Dmitri, then the boy Jiren, who wept silently as the crystalline filaments invaded his nervous system. Each transformation was slightly different, each individual reaction unique, but the result was always the same. Consciousness dissolved into something larger, identity subsumed into collective purpose. Senna, the agrodome worker, was the last before me. She looked at the throne with undisguised hatred, her weathered hands clenched into fists. 40 years I spent trying to make things grow in poisoned soil, she said. 40 years fighting to bring life to a dead world. And this is my reward? Your reward is eternal service, the tech adept replied without emotion. Your essence will guide ships across the galaxy. Your sacrifice will preserve millions of lives. What greater purpose could any individual serve? The purpose of living, she spat. But she sat in the throne anyway, because there was no choice. Her transformation was the most violent yet, her body convulsing for long minutes before finally going still. But even in death, even connected to the machine, something of her defiance seemed to remain. The readings fluctuated more wildly than the others, as if some part of her consciousness was still fighting. And then it was my turn. The throne was warm when I settled into it, heated by some internal mechanism, or perhaps by the psychic energy flowing through the chamber. The material felt organic somehow, as if it were made from living tissue rather than metal or stone. As the restraints closed around my arms and legs, I caught a glimpse of the central throne and realized with horror that I could see something moving within its crystalline matrix. A face, human, but transformed by 10,000 years of exposure to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness that oversaw this facility, trapped within the machine, watching everything with eyes that held the accumulated weight of millions of deaths. Those eyes turned toward me as the first needle slid home. The pain was indescribable. Not physical pain, though that was certainly present, but something deeper. The pain of having your very essence torn apart and examined, categorized, prepared for consumption. I felt my memories being sifted through by an intelligence vast and alien and utterly indifferent to my suffering. My first day at the manufactorum, the pride I had felt when I successfully repaired a particularly complex grinding mechanism. The girl I had loved for 3 perfect weeks before she was transferred to another sector. The taste of real meat on Foundation Day, a rare treat in a life of processed protein. The sound of rain on the Hab block roof during one of Terra's infrequent storms. All of it catalogued, filed away, prepared for integration into the greater whole. But there was something else in the examination, a presence that felt different from the cold, analytical intelligence that was processing my memories. Older, more human, infinitely sad. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness trapped within the central throne was not just observing the process, it was participating in it, adding its own sorrow to the transformation. Each death diminished it somehow. Each new soul added to the choir took something away from what it had once been. "I am sorry," it whispered, directly into my dissolving mind. "I am so very sorry." The voice was not the mechanical drone of the tech adepts or the inhuman majesty I had expected from anything connected to the Emperor. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, sacrificed too much in service of a cause that demanded ever greater sacrifices. Why? I managed to ask, though whether I spoke the word aloud or simply thought it, I could not tell. Images flooded my consciousness in response. The galaxy as seen from the perspective of the Golden Throne. Millions of worlds spinning in the darkness. Each one precious, each one fragile. Ships moving through the warp, guided by the light of the Astronomicon. Colonies being founded on distant worlds. Children being born under alien suns. Humanity spreading across the stars, carrying the spark of consciousness to every corner of the galaxy. And pressing in from all sides, the enemies that sought to extinguish that spark. Chaos fleets massing in the Eye of Terror, tyrannid hive ships approaching from the dark between galaxies, orc warbands gathering momentum as they swept across entire sectors, ancient Necron tomb worlds awakening after millions of years of slumber, technologies that made human science look like a child playing with sticks, wielded by consciousnesses that had survived the death of their own gods, and worse things that existed in the spaces between dimensions, pressing against the barriers that kept them at bay. Things that fed on reality itself, growing stronger with every breach in the walls between worlds. Things that whispered promises of power to those foolish enough to listen, always demanding just a little more, just one more compromise, until their victims were completely consumed. The Emperor saw all of it, every threat, every crisis, every small victory and crushing defeat. His consciousness stretched across the galaxy like a web, touching every world that bore his name, every ship that flew under his banner, every soul that knelt in prayer before his image. And somehow, impossibly, he held it all together, not through force alone, though his power was beyond mortal comprehension, not through fear, though his enemies had good reason to dread his attention. He held it together through will, through the absolute refusal to surrender, no matter how hopeless the situation became, through the determination to protect humanity, even if it meant becoming something that humanity might no longer recognize as one of their own. The irony was not lost on him. I could feel his awareness of it in the moments between crises, in the brief pauses when his attention was not focused on some distant emergency. He had become the very thing he had once sought to destroy, a god emperor demanding worship from his subjects, a tyrant sustained by the blood of...
And yet he endured, for us, for the species that had birthed him, and then demanded that he become something beyond their comprehension, for the future that might still be possible, however distant it seemed. Through our connection to the Astronomicon, I began to understand the true scope of the eternal war that raged across the galaxy. Not the simple narrative of good versus evil that was taught in the Imperial Creed, but something far more complex and terrible. A struggle between different concepts of existence itself, fought on scales that dwarfed individual lives, individual worlds, even individual species. The forces of chaos sought to drag the material universe into the warp, to transform reality into an endless nightmare where emotion and will shaped the fundamental laws of physics. They offered power and freedom, but at the cost of sanity and ultimately existence itself. What they called liberation was actually the dissolution of everything that made consciousness meaningful. The Tyranids represented a different kind of extinction, not the chaotic dissolution of reality, but its complete consumption. They would devour every world, every life form, every scrap of organic matter, leaving behind only empty husks drifting in the void. There would be no suffering in their vision of the future because there would be nothing left to suffer. The Necrons sought to impose their own order on the galaxy, an order based on the supremacy of the mechanical over the organic, of death over life, of stasis over change. They had already achieved their own version of immortality by abandoning flesh for living metal, and they viewed biological life as an aberration to be corrected. Each enemy offered its own form of finality. Each represented a different way for human consciousness to end forever. Against them all stood the Imperium, flawed and brutal and monstrously oppressive, but still the last bastion of human existence. And at its heart, keeping it all together through sheer force of will, sat the Golden Throne. I could feel its presence now in ways that my living mind never could have comprehended. It was not simply a machine or a throne or a life support system. It was a nexus point where multiple dimensions intersected, a place where the Emperor's consciousness could expand beyond the boundaries of single flesh and touch every corner of human space simultaneously. The technology was ancient beyond measure, built during the dark age of technology when humanity had reached heights of scientific achievement that would not be seen again for tens of thousands of years. It had been designed for a different purpose originally, as a gateway between dimensions. But the Emperor had modified it, adapted it, turned it into something that could sustain his transformed existence. But it was failing. 10,000 years of constant operation had taken their toll. Components that had been designed to last for millennia were breaking down. Systems that had once operated with perfect efficiency were developing flaws, inconsistencies, failures that required ever more psychic energy to overcome. The 1,000 souls sacrificed daily had once been a manageable drain on the Emperor's power. Now they barely sustain him from one day to the next. Soon, even that would not be enough. Through the collective consciousness of the Astronomicon, I could perceive the calculations running constantly in the depths of his divine intelligence. Statistical models predicting the rate of decay, probability matrices exploring potential solutions, contingency plans for scenarios too terrible to contemplate. The conclusion was always the same. The Golden Throne would fail within the next few centuries. When it did, the Emperor would die. The Astronomicon would go dark, and humanity would be left alone in a galaxy full of enemies who had been waiting 10,000 years for exactly this moment. Unless something changed. I felt his attention turn toward a particular region of space, far from Terra, where something unprecedented was happening. A human world where the impossible had occurred, where someone had found a way to create new technology that actually worked, that enhanced human capabilities instead of simply maintaining what already existed. For the first time in 10 millennia, humanity was innovating again. The implications sent ripples through the choir of souls that made up the Astronomicon. If this development could be protected, nurtured, allowed to spread, it might represent hope for the future, a way forward that did not depend on the slow decay of ancient systems or the daily sacrifice of innocence. But it would have to be protected. The forces of chaos had noticed the innovation as well, and they were moving to corrupt it, to turn humanity's new hope into another weapon in their arsenal. Orc fleets were converging on the sector, drawn by the promise of new technology to loot and destroy. Tyranid scout ships probed the outer systems, tasting the genetic diversity that new human colonies represented. The Emperor's will focused like a laser beam on that distant region of space. Power flowed through us, through the Astronomicon, across thousands of light years to manifest as miracle and intervention. Space Marine chapters received visions directing them toward the threatened worlds. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves reinforced by troops who should have been deployed elsewhere. Tech priests discovered ancient STC fragments that had been lost for millennia, giving them the tools they needed to understand and protect the new innovations. The effort was enormous. I felt the strain ripple through every soul in the choir as the Emperor drew on our essence to fuel his intervention. Some of us simply burned out, our consciousness dissolved completely as our psychic energy was consumed. Others held on, but were diminished, reduced to shadows of what we had been. And still, it was not enough. The innovations were spreading, but slowly. The defenses were holding, but barely. The enemy forces were too numerous, too determined, too well coordinated to be stopped by conventional means. Something more was needed, something that had not been tried in 10,000 years of warfare. I felt the Emperor's consciousness turn inward, focusing on the deepest levels of the Golden Throne, on systems that had not been activated since the Horus Heresy. Ancient protocols that had been designed for the most desperate of circumstances, powers that he had sworn never to use again because the cost was too terrible to contemplate. But the alternative was worse. The transformation began slowly, so subtly that at first I thought it was simply another fluctuation in the psychic energy flowing through the throne. But gradually, I became aware that something fundamental was changing.
The boundaries between dimensions were becoming more permeable. The distinction between the material universe and the warp was beginning to blur. Not the chaotic dissolution that the forces of chaos sought to impose, but something controlled, directed, purposeful. The Emperor was transforming the space around Terra into something new, a realm where his will could manifest directly without the need for intermediary systems or psychic conduits. It was glorious. It was terrifying. It was the birth of something that had never existed before in the history of the galaxy, a god ascending to true divinity. The process sent shockwaves through every soul connected to the Astronomicon. We felt ourselves being drawn into the transformation, our individual consciousness becoming part of something vast and sublime and utterly beyond human comprehension. This was not the gradual dissolution we had experienced when first connected to the throne. This was apotheosis. But it came at a price. The power required for such a transformation was beyond what even the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls could provide. The Emperor was drawing on deeper reserves, tapping into the very foundations of the Golden Throne itself. Systems that had operated flawlessly for 10 millennia began to fail as their energy was redirected toward the great work. And we began to burn. Not the slow, controlled burning that had sustained the Astronomicon for 10,000 years, but a fierce conflagration that consumed everything we were and had ever been. Our memories, our personalities, our individual consciousness, all of it fed into the fires of transformation. I felt Mira's presence flicker and fade as her essence was consumed. Marcus followed moments later, his steady influence suddenly absent from the choir. One by one, the souls I had come to know during our brief existence in the Astronomicon were burned away, their sacrifice fueling something greater than any of us could have imagined. My own dissolution began shortly after. The memories that had defined Callan Voss started to slip away like sand through fingers. My childhood in the lower hive, the pride I had felt in my work at the Manufacturer Forum, the taste of real food and the sound of rainfall and the face of the girl I had loved for 3 perfect weeks. All of it feeding the fire that would remake the galaxy. But even as my individual identity crumbled, I felt something remarkable happening. The boundaries between the souls in the choir were dissolving, but instead of oblivion, we were merging into something new. Not the cold mechanical unity of a hive mind, but a warm, organic fusion of consciousness that preserved the best of what each of us had been while creating something infinitely greater. We were becoming part of the Emperor himself, not as servants or tools or sources of energy, but as integral